The first time Eli Navarro saw Colton Reyes, he was standing barefoot in wet grass at 6 in the morning, holding a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at Eli like he'd been waiting for him his whole life. "You're early," Colton said. His voice was rough with sleep, and the porch light behind him made his messy hair glow gold at the edges. "You're staring," Eli said back, before he could stop himself. Neither of them looked away. Not for 3 full seconds, which doesn't sound like long, until you're standing in it, until the air between two strangers suddenly feels thick enough to hold. Then Colton smiled, slow and crooked, and said the line that would replay in Eli's head for weeks afterward. "Good. Don't stop." Eli had no idea, in that moment, that within 4 months he'd be standing in this same yard in the rain, holding Colton's face in both hands, close enough to feel his breath shake, close enough to almost kiss him, before everything fell apart. But that's later. First, there was a lawn. And a boy who wasn't supposed to matter. Eli Navarro was 20 years old, broke, and 2 months behind on rent for the tiny apartment he shared with his cousin. He'd taken the lawn care job off a flyer stapled to a telephone pole, yard help wanted, cash paid, ask for Colton, because it was the only listing that didn't require a car he didn't have. The address was 4 blocks from his place. He could walk it. He hadn't expected the house to be beautiful. Big front porch, white shutters, a garden gone slightly wild at the edges like nobody had touched it in a while. He hadn't expected the guy who answered the door to be beautiful either, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tired, sad eyes that made you want to ask what happened, even though you just met him. "You're the mower guy," Colton said. "Not a question." Eli said, sticking his hand out like an idiot, like this was a job interview and not somebody's backyard. Colton looked at the hand for a second too long before he shook it. "Colton. The grass is out back. Fair warning, it's basically a jungle. My dad used to do it, before," he stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Before. Anyway. $20 an hour, cash, however long it takes." "Deal," Eli said, and didn't ask about the before. "Not yet." That first day, Colton didn't leave him alone to work. He sat on the back steps in a faded college hoodie, scrolling his phone without really looking at it, glancing up every few minutes like he was checking Eli was still there. Around the second hour, he brought out 2 glasses of lemonade without being asked, and sat down on the porch steps closer than a stranger really needed to. "You always watch the help work?" Eli asked, wiping sweat off his forehead with his forearm. "Only the ones worth watching," Colton said, and then went red so fast Eli almost laughed, except his own face was doing the same thing, and neither of them mentioned it. And the lemonade sat between them going warm while the conversation wandered somewhere neither of them expected: colleges they didn't finish, fathers they didn't talk to, the specific loneliness of being 20 and stuck. By the time Eli left that afternoon, his arms ached, his shirt was soaked through, and he had absolutely no memory of mowing half the lawn. He only remembered the sound of Colton's laugh, low and surprised, like he hadn't used it in a while and had forgotten he still had it. He came back the next week. And the week after that. The lawn never seemed to need him as urgently as it had that first day. Colton kept finding reasons to schedule him, but Eli didn't say anything, because he didn't want it to stop either. Somewhere around the 6th visit, it stopped being a job. Eli started showing up in cleaner shirts. Colton started making actual food instead of lemonade, grilled cheese, then eventually real dinners, since you're basically working through mine anyway. They'd sit on the back porch steps after Eli finished, shoulders almost touching, watching the sky go orange, talking about nothing and everything until it was too dark to see the grass they just cut. Colton told him about his dad, eventually, not all at once, but in pieces, the way people hand you the truth when they're not sure yet if you'll drop it. His father had left 2 years ago. No warning, no explanation, just gone one Tuesday morning, leaving Colton with a house too big for one person and a yard he couldn't bring himself to touch because his dad used to do it every Sunday, shirtless, singing badly to the radio. "I hired you because I couldn't do it myself," Colton admitted one evening, staring at his hands. "Every time I picked up the mower I don't know. Froze." "You don't have to explain that to me," Eli said quietly. "I know," Colton said. "I want to, though." That was the thing about Colton, he wanted things out loud, even when it cost him something to say them. Eli, on the other hand, had spent his whole life folding his feelings up small enough to fit in his pocket where nobody could see them, especially the feelings he wasn't supposed to have. Like the ones creeping up on him now, every time Colton looked at him like that, open, unguarded, a little too long. It was on a Thursday, weeks in, that things tipped. They'd finished early. The sun was still up. Colton had turned the hose on Eli halfway through mowing, completely unprovoked, laughing so hard he could barely aim, and Eli had tackled him into the grass in retaliation, and then they were both just lying there, soaked, breathless, laughing at the sky. When the laughing stopped, neither of them moved. Colton was propped up on one elbow, close enough that Eli could count the water droplets on his eyelashes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his skin despite the cold hose water between them. His eyes dropped, just for a second, to Eli's mouth. Eli's heart did something violent and unfamiliar in his chest. "Eli," Colton said, so quiet it was almost lost in the breeze. "Yeah? I don't know what I'm doing right now." "Neither do I," Eli whispered back, and meant it about everything, not just the 6 inches of space closing between their faces, not just the way his whole body had gone electric and still at once. They were close enough to feel each other's breath, close enough that stopping felt harder than continuing, when Colton's phone buzzed violently in his pocket, shattering the moment like glass. He pulled back like he'd been burned, scrambling upright, apologizing for something neither of them could name. Sorry, that shouldn't have." "It's fine," Eli said too fast, standing too, brushing wet grass off his jeans, feeling the loss of that almost moment like something physically taken from him. It wasn't fine. It was the furthest thing from fine. But neither of them said so, and Eli went home that night and lay awake until 3 a.m. replaying 6 inches of space he never got to close. Things got strange after that. Not bad, exactly, just careful, in a way they hadn't been before. Colton started scheduling the yard work less often. When Eli did come, Colton kept the conversation light, surface level, like he was carefully avoiding every subject that had ever made his voice go soft. Eli told himself it was for the best. Told himself a lot of things, actually, that he'd imagined the moment in the grass, that Colton probably regretted it, that a confused moment didn't mean anything, even if Eli had spent every night since replaying the exact color of his eyes in that light. Then Marcus showed up. Marcus was Colton's friend from college, good-looking in an effortless, easy way, the kind of guy who filled a room without trying. He started coming around on the days Eli worked, always finding a reason to sit close to Colton on the porch, always laughing a beat too loud at things that weren't that funny. And Colton, quiet, careful Colton, laughed back. Leaned in. Let Marcus's hand rest on his shoulder like it belonged there. Eli told himself it didn't matter. He mowed faster those days. Left earlier. Said less. "You've been weird," Colton said one afternoon, catching him at the gate before he could leave. "I've been working," Eli said, not looking at him. "Eli." Colton's voice had that quiet, direct quality that always undid him. "Did I do something?" "You almost kissed me in the grass and then pretended you didn't," Eli thought. "You let another guy touch you like that in front of me, and I don't know why it feels like something's being taken from me when nothing was ever mine to lose." "No," Eli said instead. "I'm just tired." He wasn't a good liar. Colton's face told him so, that flicker of hurt, quickly hidden, the kind of look that meant he knew exactly what was being left unsaid and had decided not to push. Eli left that day with his chest aching in a way lawn work had nothing to do with. 3 days later, Colton texted him to say he didn't need the yard done that week. He didn't text the week after either. It was raining the night everything finally cracked open, one of those sudden summer storms that turns the sky the color of a bruise in minutes. Eli hadn't planned to go back to that house. He told himself he was just walking, that the route happened to pass by, that it was pure coincidence he ended up standing at Colton's gate at 9 at night with rain soaking through his jacket. The porch light was on. Colton was sitting on the steps, alone, staring at nothing, exactly the way he had the very first morning Eli met him, except now his shoulders were shaking, just slightly, and Eli realized with a lurch that he was crying. "Colton?" Colton's head snapped up. For a second he looked like he might pretend everything was fine, that same old reflex, but something in his face gave way instead. "Marcus and I we were never," he laughed, broken and wet. "He kissed me last week." And I felt nothing. Nothing, Eli. And I've been sitting here for an hour trying to figure out why, and I already know why, and I'm so tired of pretending I don't. Eli's heart was slamming against his ribs. Why? He made himself ask, even though some reckless, hopeful part of him already knew. Colton stood up. The rain had soaked through his shirt, sticking it to his chest, his hair dripping into eyes that were fixed, finally, unflinchingly, on Eli's. Because it's not him I think about, Colton said, voice cracking wide open. It's been you since the first morning you showed up in my yard and told me I was staring. I've been staring since. I don't know how to stop. The distance between them, which had felt like a canyon for weeks, closed in 3 steps. I got scared, Colton said, closer now, close enough that Eli could feel the heat coming off him despite the cold rain. That day in the grass I got scared of how much I wanted it. I've never wanted anyone the way I want you, and it terrified me, and I pushed you away instead of just being honest, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Colton. Eli's voice came out rough, wrecked. His hands found Colton's face, rain-slick and warm despite everything, thumbs brushing along his jaw the way he'd wanted to for months. Stop talking. Why? Because I don't want to hear one more excuse, Eli whispered, forehead dropping to rest against his. I want you to just. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Colton closed the last inch of space between them, and Eli met him halfway, and the kiss that followed was slow and certain and tasted like rain and relief and every unspoken week between them finally exhaling at once. Colton's hands found the back of Eli's soaked jacket, fisting into it like he was afraid this was a dream that would end if he let go. Eli felt something in his chest that had been clenched for months finally unclench. When they broke apart, both breathless, foreheads still pressed together, Colton laughed, that same low, surprised laugh from the very first day, except now there was nothing sad in it at all. I should have done that in the grass, he murmured. You had 4 months, Eli said, smiling against his mouth. I was starting to think you never would. I was scared of what it meant. And now? Colton pulled back just far enough to look at him properly, really look, the way he had that first morning on the porch, except now there was nothing hidden behind it. Now I'm just scared of how long I would have kept running if you hadn't shown up in the rain. They didn't rush to explain it to anyone. Some things you protect for a while before you hand them to the world. Eli understood that instinct better than most, and Colton, still learning how to want something out loud without flinching, needed the quiet as much as he did. But the yard changed after that night. Eli kept coming, though it stopped being about the grass a long time ago. Sometimes they didn't even make it outside, they'd sit in the kitchen instead, Colton cooking badly and Eli making fun of him for it, both of them finding every excuse to stay close, to touch a hand, a shoulder, the back of a neck, like they were making up for 4 months of almosts. One evening in early autumn, sitting on the same back steps where it all began, Colton reached over and laced their fingers together without a word, like it was the easiest, most obvious thing in the world. The leaves in the yard he used to be too afraid to touch were turning gold, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't flinch at the thought of his father's absence in that garden. I used to think I hired you to fix the lawn, Colton said quietly, watching the sunset instead of Eli, though his thumb kept tracing slow circles over Eli's knuckles. And now? Now I think the lawn was just an excuse the universe used to get you into my yard. Eli leaned his head against Colton's shoulder, watching the same gold light spill over grass that no longer felt like a wound, but like the place where something had finally, quietly, begun to heal. Best $20 an hour I ever made, Eli murmured. Colton laughed, that same laugh, warm now instead of sad, and pressed a kiss to the top of his head like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was. If this story made your heart race, don't scroll away yet. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, like this video if Eli and Colton deserved that ending, and drop a comment telling me the moment that got you the porch, the almost kiss in the grass, or the rain. You told your mom what? Eli nearly dropped the mug he was holding. It was a Sunday morning, 6 weeks after the storm, and he'd been standing at Colton's kitchen counter in one of Colton's old t-shirts, hair still damp from the shower, when Colton casually mentioned, between bites of burnt toast, that he'd called his mother the night before and told her everything. I told her about you, Colton said again, like it was the easiest sentence in the world, though his knuckles had gone white around his coffee cup. About us. I couldn't keep doing the thing where I edit my whole life every time she calls. I'm tired of editing. Eli set the mug down carefully, like it might shatter if he moved too fast. And she cried. Eli's stomach dropped straight through the floor. Colton. Good crying, Colton said quickly, reaching across the counter to catch Eli's hand before the fear could fully take hold. She said, his voice caught, and for a second the confident, joking version of him from a minute ago was gone, replaced by someone much younger, much more frightened. She said she'd wondered for a long time. She said she just wanted me happy. She asked when she could meet you. Eli felt his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. She wants to meet me? She wants to meet you, Colton confirmed, and the smile that broke across his face was the kind Eli had only seen a handful of times, unguarded, blinding, entirely undefended. Next Sunday. Dinner. I already told her yes before I asked you, which I realize now was presumptuous, but I'll be there, Eli said, before he could finish the sentence. Colton exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 6 weeks. Maybe he had. If Colton's mother was the easy part, Eli's cousin Renzo was going to be the hard part. Eli and Renzo had shared the cramped 2-bedroom apartment for 3 years, ever since Eli moved to the city with nothing but a duffel bag and the vague promise of community college classes he could never quite afford to finish. Renzo was older, protective in the loud, teasing way of someone who'd grown up being the responsible one, and he had absolutely no idea that the yard job Eli had been vanishing to 4 evenings a week had turned into something else entirely. It was Renzo who figured it out, in the end, not through any grand confrontation, but the mundane way most secrets actually come apart. He picked up Eli's phone off the couch to check the score of a game, and a text from Colton lit up the screen. Miss you already. Come back soon. See yellow heart. Renzo stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at Eli, who had frozen in the kitchen doorway, half a glass of water still in his hand. The lawn guy, Renzo said slowly. It wasn't a question, not really. More like a man doing math out loud. His name is Colton, Eli said, because it felt important, suddenly, that Renzo know that, not the lawn guy, not a secret, not a rumor. A name. A person. Someone Eli loved. The word landed in the room before Eli even realized he'd thought it, let alone meant to say it out loud like that, so plainly, without the careful hedges he usually wrapped around anything that mattered to him. Renzo set the phone down on the counter, very deliberately, the way you'd set down something fragile. For a second, Eli's heart pounded so hard he thought he might be sick. You love him, Renzo said. Still not a question. Renzo. I'm not mad, Renzo said, cutting him off, and something in his voice had gone soft in a way Eli hadn't heard since they were kids, since the year their grandmother died and Renzo had sat up with him every night so he wouldn't have to be alone with it. I'm not Eli, look at me. I'm not mad. I'm just wondering why you didn't tell me. Because I didn't know how, Eli admitted, voice cracking on the last word. Because I've spent my whole life folding this part of myself up small enough that nobody would ever have to see it, and I didn't know what would happen if I finally let it out into the open, in front of you, in front of anyone who actually mattered. Renzo crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled him into a hug so tight it knocked the air out of him. You matter, Renzo said into his shoulder, rough and sincere. All of you. The parts you show me and the parts you don't. You didn't have to fold anything up around me. Not ever. Eli cried then, the kind of crying that had been building for years, not just weeks, the release of a weight he hadn't even fully realized he was carrying until someone finally helped him set it down. So, Renzo said eventually, pulling back, wiping his own eyes with the back of his hand and trying, badly, to sound casual. This Colton. He treats you right? He does, Eli said, and for the first time saying it out loud didn't feel like a confession. It felt like a fact. A good one. Then I want to meet him, Renzo said. And if he doesn't, I know where he lives. I've seen the lawn. Eli laughed a real laugh, wet and surprised, and for the first time in years, felt like every part of himself was finally standing in the same room. Sunday dinner at Colton's mother's house started, predictably, as a disaster. Eli showed up too early, brought the wrong kind of wine, and spent the first 10 minutes standing awkwardly in the front hallway while Colton's mother, Diane, looked him over with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who had raised a son alone for 2 years and had earned the right to be careful about who got close to him. "So you're the one," she said finally. "I'm the one," Eli confirmed, bracing himself. Then her whole face broke open into a smile so like Colton's it made Eli's chest ache. "He hasn't stopped smiling in 6 weeks," she said, pulling him into a hug before he could react. "Do you know how long it's been since I've seen that boy smile like that? Come in. Sit down. Tell me everything you're not supposed to on a first dinner." Somewhere behind her, Colton buried his face in his hands, mortified and radiant all at once, and Eli understood, watching him standing in the doorway of the house he'd once been too afraid to touch the grass of, that this was what healing actually looked like. Not a single dramatic moment, but 100 small, ordinary ones: a mother's hug, a cousin's fierce loyalty, a boy laughing without flinching in his own kitchen. Dinner ran 3 hours longer than planned. Diane told embarrassing stories about 6-year-old Colton refusing to wear anything but a superhero cape for an entire summer. Colton retaliated by telling her, in vivid detail, about the day Eli got tackled into wet grass and came up looking like a drowned cat. By the time Eli finally left that night, his cheeks ached from laughing and his hand was warm from being held under the table the entire meal. At the door, Diane caught his arm gently before he could go. "Take care of him," she said, quiet enough that Colton couldn't hear from the kitchen. "He gives everything to the people he loves. Sometimes too much. Make sure he knows it's safe to." "I will," Eli promised. "I already am." The lawn didn't need mowing anymore, not really. Eli had long since traded the mower for a set of keys of his own, and the wild garden edges Colton's father had left untouched had been slowly, patiently coaxed back to life over the past year, this time by 2 sets of hands instead of 1. On the anniversary of that first rainy night, Colton found Eli sitting on the same back steps where it had all started, watching the sunset the way he'd watched it 100 times since. Colton sat down beside him, exactly as close as that very first evening, and pressed a small velvet box into his palm without a word. Eli's breath caught. "Colton." "I'm not asking yet," Colton said quickly, laughing at his own nerves, cheeks going pink the way they had that very first morning. I wanted you to have something. Something that says I'm not going anywhere. That whenever you're ready, I already know the answer I want to give." Inside the box was a small silver ring, plain and simple, engraved on the inside with 4 words that made Eli's eyes sting the moment he read them. "Good. Don't stop. See?" Eli looked up at him, this boy who had once stood barefoot in wet grass, terrified of his own yard, terrified of his own heart, and who had, slowly, patiently, chosen honesty over fear again and again until there was nothing left between them but this, gold light, gathered grass, and a promise neither of them was afraid of anymore. "I'm not planning on it," Eli said, sliding the ring onto his finger. "Not ever." The sun kept setting the way it always had over that yard, the same gold light, the same warm grass, the same 2 steps where a job had quietly, irreversibly, become a life. Except this time, when Colton leaned in to kiss him, there was no hesitation left in either of them at all. Only certainty. Only home. "You're going to wear a hole in that porch," Renzo said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and a grin he wasn't even trying to hide. Eli stopped pacing just long enough to glare at him. "I can't find my other cufflink." "It's in your hand." Eli looked down. It was, in fact, in his hand. He let out a breath that was half laugh, half panic, and sat down hard on the edge of the bed, staring at the small silver ring on his finger like it might explain how, exactly, 2 years had gone by so fast that this, today, had actually arrived. "Hey!" Renzo crossed the room and sat beside him, all the teasing gone out of his voice now. "You good?" "I don't know how to explain it," Eli said quietly. "I keep thinking about that first morning. The flyer on the telephone pole. If I'd walked 2 blocks the other direction that day, I never would've." He shook his head. "I don't know. It feels too big to be real. Like if I say it out loud, it'll turn out to be something I imagined." Renzo bumped his shoulder against Eli's. "It's real. I checked. I signed the paperwork as a witness 2 weeks ago, remember? Pretty sure the county doesn't process imaginary weddings." Eli laughed, and some of the tightness in his chest finally loosened. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it. For not letting me fold myself up small anymore." "You did that part yourself," Renzo said, standing and pulling him up by the hand. "I just refused to let you do it alone. Now come on. There's a guy standing at the end of an aisle right now, and if you keep him waiting any longer he's going to come looking for you himself, cufflinks or not." The ceremony was small. Diane in the front row already crying before anyone had said a word, Renzo standing beside Eli as his best man, a scattering of friends who had watched this whole slow, careful thing unfold from a distance and had never once doubted where it was headed. The backyard where it all began had been transformed for the day, strings of warm lights threaded through the trees, folding chairs arranged in careful rows on grass that Eli himself had mowed one final time that morning, out of nothing but sentiment. When Eli came around the side of the house and saw Colton standing at the end of the aisle, something in his chest simply stopped aching for the first time in longer than he could remember. Colton was in a soft gray suit, hands clasped in front of him, and the moment their eyes met he broke into that same crooked, disbelieving smile from the very first morning, like he still couldn't quite believe Eli kept showing up. "Good," Colton mouthed, so only Eli could see it. "Don't stop." Eli didn't. He walked the length of that yard, past the garden his father-in-law had once tended and abandoned, past the porch steps where an almost kiss had once dissolved into 4 painful weeks of distance, past the exact spot where a summer storm had finally forced 2 stubborn hearts to stop hiding, until he was standing close enough to take Colton's hands in his. "I told you," Eli said quietly, just between them, before the officiant even began, "best $20 an hour you ever spent." Colton laughed, wet-eyed and unguarded, right there in front of everyone he loved. "Worth every cent," he whispered back. "Worth everything." When it came time for vows, Colton went first, and his hands were shaking so badly he had to hold the little card with both of them. "I used to think love was supposed to announce itself," he began, voice cracking on the very first sentence. "Something loud, something obvious. But you didn't announce yourself. You just showed up one morning with a mower and a smile I wasn't ready for, and you kept showing up, week after week, even when I was too scared to let you all the way in. You didn't give up on me. You didn't let me hide from myself forever. And somewhere between the lemonade and the lawn and that storm, you became the person I can't imagine my life without. I don't know how to thank someone for teaching you how to stop being afraid. So instead, I'm just going to spend the rest of my life trying." Eli was already crying by the time it was his turn, and he didn't bother hiding it. "I spent most of my life folding the parts of myself I was scared of into something small enough that nobody would notice," he said, voice thick. "You were the first person who ever looked at that folded-up version of me and said, 'Don't stop,' like you already knew there was more underneath, and you were willing to wait for it. You waited through the distance. You waited through the fear. You never once made me feel like loving you was something I needed to apologize for. I promise you every version of myself I have left to become, the folded ones, the open ones, all of it. I promise you the rest of it." By the time the officiant pronounced them married, there wasn't a dry eye left in that backyard, not Diane's, not Renzo's, not even the officiant's, who later admitted it was the first time she'd cried at her own ceremony in 11 years of doing this job. The reception spilled out under the string lights as the sky went the same deep gold it had that very first evening 2 years ago, and somewhere between the toasts and the dancing, Diane found Eli near the drink table, pulling him into a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual. "I told you to take care of him," she said, eyes shining. "Look at you. Married. Both of you so happy it's almost embarrassing." "He takes care of me too," Eli said. "It goes both ways now." "That's the whole trick," Diane said, patting his cheek fondly. "Nobody tells you that part. Love isn't one person doing all the holding. It's 2 people learning how to hold on at the same time." Across the yard, Colton was laughing at something Renzo had said, head tipped back, completely unguarded, the porch light catching gold in his hair exactly the way it had that very first morning, except now there was no sadness left underneath it at all. Eli watched him for a long moment, the way he had that first day mowing a lawn he'd barely paid attention to, and felt the same electric, grateful disbelief settle over him all over again. Colton caught him staring and raised an eyebrow across the crowd, mouthing the same 3 words that had started everything. "You're staring again." Eli just smiled, and mouthed the answer right back, the only one that had ever mattered. Good. Don't stop. If this ending made you tear up, you weren't the only one writing it. 5 years is a strange amount of time. Long enough that the wild garden edges have grown in soft and full instead of overgrown. Long enough that the porch steps have a permanent groove worn into them from two people sitting there almost every evening, rain or shine. Not long enough, somehow, for Eli to stop noticing the exact way the light hits Colton's face at sunset, that same gold he fell for on a stranger's porch half a decade ago. "You're staring again," Colton said, not looking up from the crib he was building on the living room floor, surrounded by a small mountain of Allen wrenches and instructions he'd already given up reading. "Some things don't change," Eli said, sitting down on the arm of the couch, watching him work. They'd been approved for adoption 3 months earlier, a process that had taken almost 2 years of paperwork, interviews, and waiting rooms, but which had ended, finally, with a phone call neither of them would ever forget. A little girl, 8 months old, named Wren. She was due to come home in 6 days, and the house that had once held nothing but one man's grief and an untouched lawn was now, slowly, filling up with the particular chaos of getting ready for a child neither of them could quite believe was really coming. "Do you think I'll be good at this?" Colton asked suddenly, hands going still on the half-built crib. It was the question he'd been circling for weeks, never quite landing on it directly until now. Eli slid down onto the floor beside him, close the way he always was, and took one of Colton's hands in both of his. "I think," he said carefully, "about the guy who couldn't touch his own lawn for 2 years because it reminded him too much of losing someone he loved. And I think about how that same guy spent every day since teaching himself how to stop being afraid of loving people too much. I don't think there's anyone better suited to being somebody's whole world than you." Colton's eyes went bright and wet, the way they still did sometimes, 5 years in, when Eli said something that reached all the way down. "You always know exactly what to say." "I had a good teacher," Eli said. "You taught me it's safe to say things out loud instead of folding them up small." The next weekend, cleaning out the garage to make room for a stroller, Eli found it, the old push mower, the very same one from that first flyer off a telephone pole summer, rusted slightly at the handle but otherwise exactly as it had always been. He stood there holding it for a long moment, and Colton, coming up behind him with 2 boxes of baby clothes, stopped in the doorway when he saw his face. "You okay?" "I was just thinking," Eli said, running his thumb along the worn handle, "that this thing changed my whole life. And it doesn't even know it." Colton set the boxes down and came to stand beside him, resting his chin on Eli's shoulder the way he always had, looking at the mower like it was something sacred. "We should keep it," he said. "Not to use. Just keep it. Somewhere Wren can see it someday, when she's old enough to hear the story of how her dads met. You want to tell our daughter that you fell in love with the guy you hired to cut your grass?" "I want to tell her," Colton said, turning Eli gently by the shoulder so they were facing each other, "that sometimes the most ordinary things, a flyer, a lawn, a rainy Tuesday, turn out to be the beginning of everything. I want her to know that love doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like someone showing up, week after week, until you're brave enough to stop pretending you don't need them." Eli didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just leaned in and kissed him, right there in the garage, surrounded by rust and moving boxes and 5 years of a life neither of them had expected but both had chosen, over and over, every single day since. The day Wren came home, the whole yard was full of people again. Diane, practically glowing, already fighting Renzo over who got to hold her first, Marcus, of all people, who'd become an unlikely close friend in the years since that one awkward almost relationship, standing off to the side with a gift bag and a grin, neighbors who'd watched, over 5 years, an abandoned garden slowly bloom back into something alive. Eli stood on the porch steps holding his daughter for the first time, feeling something settle into place in his chest that he hadn't even realized was still unsettled, some final piece of the boy who used to fold himself up small, finally, completely, at peace. Colton sat down beside him the way he always did, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked down at Wren's small sleeping face with an expression Eli had never quite seen on him before, something so unguarded, so entirely undefended, that it took his breath away all over again. The same way it had that very first morning on this exact porch. "Good," Colton murmured, brushing a thumb gently over their daughter's tiny hand, then looking up to meet Eli's eyes with a smile that held 5 years of almosts and rain and vows inside it. "Don't stop." Eli smiled back, and out in the yard, the grass, full, green, cared for, alive, caught the last of the evening light exactly the way it always had.
Home didn't look the way Eli had ever imagined it would.
It looked like a rusted mower in a garage. It looked like a porch worn smooth by two people who never stopped choosing each other. It looked like a little girl asleep in her father's arms, in a yard that had once held nothing but grief, and now held nothing but this. It looked like this. It had always been going to look like this.